African American men who are mentally ill, I believe, have like a 16 times more likely chance of being shot and killed by police officers than any other demographic.
Hello, I'm Jer Stays. Today on Your Daily Detroit for Monday, November 7th, 2022, we talk about the Porter Burks case. While in mental crisis, the 22-year-old black man was shot 19 times by Detroit police on the city's west side earlier this year. Police allege he was carrying a knife and went for officers, but video of the incident shows a lot of distance between Burks and the police. The incident has drawn national attention, protests, and raised questions about how we should respond to and care for people in these situations. There's also a $50 million lawsuit filed on behalf of the family against both the city of Detroit and the 5 officers involved. Attorney Geoffrey Fieger's case alleges assault, battery, gross negligence, wanton and willful misconduct, violation of department policies, and violations of the Freedom of Information Act and Persons with Disabilities Civil Rights Acts. To help sort this out, an attorney who I believe is an expert in the field, Vince Colella. He joins me as we discuss police use of force, mental health, the state of this $50 million case as it is today, and some likely outcomes. Thanks to our members at patreon.com/dailydetroit for supporting our coverage of the issues that matter in our region. And let's get started. Joining me virtually to help unpack this case, Vince Colella. He's the managing partner of Moss & Colella, a personal injury and civil rights firm in Southfield in the beautiful state of Michigan. It's good to hear from you again.
Hey, it's good to be back on your podcast. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And I'll start with the caveat when it comes to this Porter Burks case that you are not involved directly in this case. We are both kind of working off of the same set of information that the public has. We have no inside information, et cetera. But I thought because it's a topic that people are talking about, there are a lot of interesting moving pieces that would be good to set the table on the facts with this and then talk about what's ahead, especially now that a lawsuit for $50 million has been filed against the city of Detroit. The Detroit Police Department says that they're not going to be talking anymore about this case. So I feel like this is the pause point to be like, okay, what are the pieces in play? And go from there, Vince.
I don't have any direct or really indirect other than what I've read and seen through the media, social media, etc. At this point, it looks like the criminal investigation may still be ongoing. I'm not certain whether or not that's been completed or not. I know that if it has been completed, that the investigation reports from the state police would then be turned over to the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office, and they would review the case to determine whether to charge any of the officers involved in the shooting. It's my understanding, and this is me reading between the lines, because the family's attorney filed a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act count in the complaint, tells me that they probably did not get the investigation materials from the city of Detroit or their police department. Now, there's an exemption under the law that says that if there is an ongoing criminal investigation, they do not need to turn those materials over. That's what led me to believe that this investigation had not been completed and that the information was not presented to the prosecuting attorney for her to make a decision on charges.
Yeah, it's been widely reported that Porter Burks, a 20-year-old, and the medical examiner's office says that he was struck by 19 of 38 shots directed at him by Detroit police. Well, Porter Burks also dealt with schizophrenia, mental issues. The lawsuit, if you take a look at it, says at one point that he believed that he had a squirrel living inside him. The 20-year-old seemed to have a lot of mental issues, and this has just raised a lot of questions in general.
Yeah, certainly he was in a mental health crisis. It's reported that he's schizophrenic. It's reported that he had some violent background history. But clearly he was in a mental state, agitated, perhaps paranoid, the things that we would see from someone who's suffering some type of psychiatric breakdown. Unfortunately, African-American men who are mentally ill, I believe, have like a 16 times more likely chance of being shot and killed by police officers than any other demographic. And so the real sad part of this story is that our communities, our policing communities, have not figured out how to address this problem.
Well, and police were there because they were called to supposedly help him and kind of corral him a bit for the family, right?
Yeah, so my understanding is that he came home the night before with a pocket knife, and the family said, you can't come in the home with a pocket knife. And so they sent him away, and then he returned at 4 a.m. again with the pocket knife, and that's when the brother called and said that, hey, my brother is having a psychotic episode, and he needs help. And that was the impetus for the call. And then things obviously unraveled from there. You would note, by the way, that the Detroit Police Department was well aware that this was a psychiatric issue because they had the crisis intervention team on scene. This was not a surprise to them. I think based on the call, based on perhaps his past history or communications with the family regarding him, everyone was aware that this was a mentally ill, very sick young man and needed help.
So we've got both really the criminal and the civil case to look at. When it comes to the civil case, $50 million is a lot of money. What are the grounds that they're looking for? What is in their favor and what wins are against them?
It's interesting because the family's attorney at this point has only filed state law claims. They didn't file the federal civil rights claims yet, although there is some hint that that might be coming down the pipe. What's in their favor is this. Look, officers know that time and distance equals safety, and they had both. From what I gleaned from the video, the body cam video, they were on scene and in a position of safety for several minutes. They had every ability to employ less lethal alternatives, beanbag shotguns, tasers, pepper spray, even a baton, to be honest. All of these things and tactical things like, body armor, etc. And because they had the time, because they had the distance, because they had multiple units on scene, because they had every tactical advantage and simply resorted to the use of deadly force, I think does not bode well for the department or those officers. Now, the other thing that I noticed today and I saw was that at the point when Mr. Burks began to either run or approach rapidly or move in a direction of the officer, it appeared he had his hands over his head. So that to me would signify to any objective police officer under the same circumstances that while he may have been armed, that he was giving himself up in some fashion. I think all of those factors weigh in favor of the family and the family's claims against the department.
Does him being armed with a knife as opposed to, say, a gun make a difference?
Of course, because the distance factor is no longer relevant, because a bullet can take up the distance, obviously, at a great pace. That's number one. And anytime someone is armed and has brandished a weapon and has made any indication that they are going to use it, typically the courts will look at that and say, well, the officers had reasonable belief that either their lives, other officers at the scene, or bystanders were in danger. And so once you enter a gun into the situation, it's pretty much all bets are off. But with a knife, there are multiple examples across the country where officers have been found to have violated a person's constitutional rights when they have fired upon them in a situation where, despite the fact that they are armed with a knife, the officers were not reasonably in fear or should have been reasonably in fear of their own safety or the safety of others.
Does the amount of shots matter? I mean, 38 shots fired, 5 landed in an arm, 6 to the chest, 2 to the head. Like, it seems like this is a lot of force in a situation when there is that distance, right?
Yes and no. So from the officer's perspective, what they're going to say is that the quantity of rounds fired was simply because of the number of units, officers on the scene in close proximity and firing in the defense of another officer. Now, Had this been one officer who unloaded 38 rounds and 19 struck the subject, in this case, Mr. Burks, that would be different. But if they're all reacting to this threat stimuli at the same time, I think the department is going to say that that will explain away the quantity of rounds that were fired.
And what is in the city's favor?
Well, this is interesting because his history, Mr. Burks' history, I think is a double-edged sword in a way. Because in most police excess force or deadly force cases, what normally will happen, I'll open, say, an investigation file, and I will find information about the subject that's not related to the actual use of force or the shooting, but prior incidents of bad conduct. And what officers will want to do is bootstrap that information to them so that they can say from a subjective standpoint, they had a reason to fear the person based on their history, okay? And then what you have to do as a lawyer is unpack that information from the officer's threat level or experience or whatnot, or knowledge, right? Because it only matters what the officers knew at the time they made the decision to use deadly force. Now, in this case, because there were so many apparent calls to the department, runs to the house, violence that the department was made aware of, there may have been officers on that scene with that information, which would then elevate the threat level because they know that this person has at least the capacity to be dangerous. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Makes a lot of sense. Leads me to another question. There's been a lot of public pressure. In fact, I think it was even mentioned at the city council chambers for DPD to release the names of the officers. As we are recording this, those names are not public. Why would DPD want to hold on to those names?
I think they're going to claim that the safety of the officers, there is high tensions across the country right now when it comes to police shootings. And I think they're going to assert that the officer's safety is more important than revealing the names to the public, and that, quite frankly, the lawsuit could probably continue under a protective order with those names being held confidential. But at some point in time, those names are going to be released, because if the case, for example, were to go to trial, I can't imagine how you would protect their information. I don't think I've ever seen that before, to be honest. They can protect it for a while, but eventually they'll be disclosed. Maybe perhaps, when tensions damp down.
Yeah, with time. That amount, $50 million, is that on point? Do you think that's a starting point with these kinds of things? It's a good headline-catching number.
It's a headline-catching number, but look, that's a real figure to me, because there is nothing more sacred than the air we breathe, than life itself. And so I don't begrudge any lawyer for asking for those kinds of dollars when it comes to the death of a 20-year-old person. And you see juries across this country awarding damages in those ranges for deaths like this fairly routinely. So I don't think it's out of the neighborhood or excessive in any way.
This might not be necessarily within your purview, but there has been a lot of chatter around the idea that maybe don't call the police for these sorts of mental episodes, but also when somebody is showing up at a house with a knife, that's a concern. Is there a better way forward for some of this, like in a general sense from your experience?
Community mental health should be at the forefront of every politician's agenda. And they should be thinking, plotting, planning for future strategies for dealing with people that are mentally ill. It should not be incumbent upon police officers, I don't believe, to have to manage mental illness. It puts everyone into a very dangerous place when that happens. You've got officers armed with weapons. Perhaps you have the person that's armed with a weapon, and it's a recipe for disaster. I mean, there's mental health hospitals, they're able to cope and deal and manage these people and treat them. So I think it's probably best left to the professionals, and maybe there's got to be some way to interface the mental health institutions with these folks in a time of crisis without the intervention of the police. And I guess that's something we should all be talking about.
Yeah, yeah. I know that we don't have a lot of details, but what is your sense around the process and chance and the possibility of criminal charges against these officers? Because it seems like that might be brewing.
Statistically, I would say that there's very little chance of that. The Washington Post, I believe, keeps the most updated records on police shootings in the United States. And there was a time frame, I believe, between 2005 and 2015 where there were over 10,000 fatal shootings. And I believe there were 16 prosecutions and I think 2 convictions. So do the math.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty clear. And I guess before I let you go, what's next? What should people be looking for in the next coming weeks?
So the state police right now, they're still, I believe, investigating the case. Now, one of the things that's a little bit troubling to me is the fact that they have Detroit police officers that are participating in that investigation. That is something I cannot understand. In the day and age that we are in today, that screams of lack of transparency. That screams of some type of collusion. That screams of conspiracy. I don't understand how decision makers could possibly think that that's okay. Okay. But that issue aside, because that's probably going to, I think, rile some folks up, which will then add fuel to the media story. But what we can probably expect is that there'll be an answer from the city of Detroit. It'll be filed. It'll be vanilla. It won't have a lot of information. The parties will then be given a discovery order, and then they'll start taking discovery. Now, one of the things that could happen is that the city could say, well, while there's an ongoing criminal investigation, the officers are going to take the fifth, and we want to stay the proceedings until the criminal case has been decided. So there could be a pause that's pressed by the circuit court judge, because they'll say, well, yeah, to the family's attorney, how can we go forward when you've got a pending criminal investigation? The officers are going to take the fifth. You're not going to be able to take discovery of them. So what's the point at this stage of continuing the litigation? Why don't we pause it, allow the criminal case to run its course, and come back when that's completed? So that is a real possibility as well.
So it's going to be a while until we have some resolution, unless, say, there's some sort of settlement or something. Because I do want to mention, from more of a more policy and process point, that the city of Detroit, this money, whatever is awarded or decided on, will come out of taxpayer pockets, because the city of Detroit is not insured for this kind of thing.
Right. They're self-insured, which means that the taxpayers will foot the bill on whatever the result is.
Well, it's definitely something that we are going to keep an eye on. And as always, Vince Colella, it is wonderful to talk to you and get a real level-headed look at what's happening and what's ahead with a case that I think has got a lot of people talking and thinking about issues that we don't always think about, such as mental health and such in Metro Detroit.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm always delighted to spend time with you and share my thoughts on these, what I believe to be very important social issues.
Good to talk to you, sir.
Great to talk to you. Thanks.
Well, that was a big and heavy topic, but I think very important to talk about. If you don't already, follow us wherever you're listening to this podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever pod machine you get to get your podcasts that are casted to the wind. We much appreciate it, and we do this every weekday. I'm Jer Stays. Remember that you are somebody, and we will see you around Detroit. Talk tomorrow.